have some other people waiting too.
For folks who are just joining us, we're going to get started in 1 minute. Thanks for your patience. Okay, I'm going to just go ahead and kick us off. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us this late morning. My name is Karen Moldovan. I'm the Director of Policy at Good Business Colorado. And I just want to say thanks again for joining. This is our second of 2 webinars that we are hosting on Colorado's climate strategy and really discussing how business leaders can get involved in our efforts to mitigate climate change in the state of Colorado. This is the second webinar. If you missed the first, I did want to mention we have it recorded on the Good Business Colorado YouTube page. It's the first one up, so I'd love for you to take a look at that if you are interested in the previous content as well. So today's webinar is co-hosted by 3 groups, E2, Good Business Colorado, and Best for Colorado. You probably know one of them, if not all, so I'm just going to give a really brief introduction so we can dive right into the content. So E2, or Environmental Entrepreneurs, is a national nonpartisan group of business leaders, investors, and others who advocate for smart policies that are good for both the economy and the environment. E2 provides kind of a time-efficient way for business leaders to make a difference on policy issues. There's 9 chapters throughout the country, and they also do both work in the federal and state advocacy space. Good Business Colorado, we are a grassroots organization of values-driven business owners, rejecting partisanship and advocating in 3 core areas to build a more prosperous economy in Colorado, more equitable communities, and a sustainable environment. Our members know that business success can't be measured by profit alone, and that true business success means that our people, our planets, our communities, and our bottom lines are all thriving. And then Best for Colorado is an initiative of the Alliance Center, a pivotal program that inspires, equips, and celebrates Colorado businesses that are creating higher quality jobs, building stronger communities, and preserving the environment. So it's just really exciting to see businesses leveraging their voices and their community leadership to engage in conversations on climate change. So I'm going to kick it over right now to one of our members. Margaret McRoberts is a member of Good Business Colorado, and she is also active in our Sustainable Environment Working Group. She's also the founder of Stella Sustainability, and she is going to start walking us through this content.
Just give me one moment here. Okay. So I'm not sure, but my screen now is not working again. So can you hear me at least? Okay, the screen is not letting me share now. So I'm going to try one more time. I apologize.
We can see you and hear you.
Good. Well, now
there we go.
Perfect. Okay, so for those of you that joined our first webinar, this will be new, same information for you. And those of you that missed it, I'm just going to quickly go over why we're here. So on May 2019, there was a House Bill 1261 followed by Senate Bill 96 passed here in Colorado. And it set forth really aggressive reduction targets using a 2005 baseline. And you'll see them right here, 26 by 2025, 50 by 2030, and 90 by 2015. And what happened with this is that it set forward a movement related to first understanding how to improve the 2005 baseline, and then from there to build a strategy so that we can meet these reduction targets. And just really quickly, this is the 2005 baseline, and what has changed now is that electricity has decreased some in its percentage and transportation has risen. Those are the major changes. And so it's important just to look at this because later on we'll have breakout sessions where we try to brainstorm some action items. So it gives you an idea of kind of what is the biggest players and what might be some low-hanging fruit. And then it's difficult sometimes, I think, to look at million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent and kind of figure out what this means. And so if we put it towards looking at it for per capita, we'll see Colorado on the far left is about 25 tons per person. And then you can look and see the United States average is relatively high compared to the global average. And it just gives us an idea of where we need to go in order to reach our reduction targets. And then also the right graph talks about the International Panel on Climate Change, intergovernmental, and you'll see that their recommendations by 2030 are almost a 50% reduction. And that's on par with the reductions we're trying to aim to reach here in Colorado. And we are very fortunate to be joined by people that have been actually working on this implementation roadmap, and they're going to answer the questions that you see listed on the slide below and give us some of their input and thought, and then we'll have time for question and answers. So the first person to join us is Clay Clarke, who's the supervisor for the Climate Change Unit. And thank you so much for joining us, Clay.
Well, thank you, Margaret, and thank you all for the opportunity to speak to you today. So as Margaret mentioned, I'm the supervisor of the newly formed climate unit within CDPHE. That unit was formed roughly at the beginning of this year. And so taking these questions in order, first I'll talk about priorities, but I'll start with the priorities as far as the work that the climate unit is tasked with, and then I'll talk about some of the larger priorities when we think about emission reduction strategies to meet those climate goals that Margaret showed on an earlier slide. So the climate unit is tasked with regulation development, overseeing the required GHG reporting that's required by sources of greenhouse gases across the state, undertaking Colorado's greenhouse gas inventory, and also verifying the GHG emission reductions that are included in clean energy plans that utilities submit with the Public Utility Commission. So sort of unpacking some of those so they're a little more understandable. When we talk about the regulation development or regulatory development, as it's often called, what we're really talking about there is taking these broad concepts, these policy concepts about how Colorado is going to achieve its climate goals, and really just distilling that down into regulations. So text on paper, if you will. And so a large part of that, beyond the actual drafting of these regulations, is the stakeholder involvement with that. We're required by law to also do an economic impact analysis for each of those rules. And what's also important is, out of that stakeholder process, there's the engagement with the communities. And of course, an important part of that now is the engagement with those communities that are disproportionately impacted by pollutants and other environmental stressors, and making sure that those communities have a seat at the table, that they're engaged, and that they're able to provide input for how these rules are developed and how those rules can benefit those communities. So once those rules are developed, we then propose those rules to the AQCC, or Air Commission as we call it, for adoption. And so on that front, since the beginning of the year, we have developed a greenhouse gas reporting rule that applies to all sources of greenhouse gases throughout Colorado's economy. We've also developed an HFC, or hydrofluorocarbon phase-out rule, and both of those rules were adopted by the Air Commission. I mentioned also the reporting rule there. The part of the reporting rule that then the climate unit is tasked with is essentially overseeing the reporting and the receipt of all that information and sort of the management of all that GHG data. So we'll sort of be the clearinghouse of all that information for the state as well. And then with that, I also mentioned we are in charge of the greenhouse gas inventory, and so that reported information is part of that as well. But we are by law required to develop and submit for public review a GHG inventory no less frequently than every 2 years. And so then turning to the priorities as far as what we see as those necessary measures for Colorado to achieve its climate goals. If I can, I might call on one of my fellow presenters. Keith, I don't know if it's possible for you to share your screen and to share the slide that has the emissions by sector. If not, and if that's too tricky, I know Keith was late to join. I know he was tied up in a PUC hearing right up until the time you joined. If that's trouble, if people can remember the slide that Margaret had shown earlier, it's basically that donut slide that shows the various sectors. And so traditionally, the power sector, we think of the traditional power plant as being the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions. But really what we're seeing now, if you're looking at sort of a real-time look at the Colorado's GHG inventory, is that transportation has surpassed electricity. And, and that's in part through legislative measures, but it's really because of innovation and market forces that are really driving down the cost of wind and solar. Battery costs for storage are now in reach. And so what we're really seeing, and we're sort of at the beginning of right now in Colorado, is this a major transition away from fossil fuels into zero carbon or non-GHG emitting electric generation. And so when it comes to the priorities, then that leaves the transportation, built environment, and the oil and gas sectors really is the real priorities. And that transition that I mentioned with oil and gas, or excuse me, with the electric sector is really key for a transformation in the transportation and built environments. So you think about, we've got this clean electricity that can then power electric vehicles, that with our built environment, we can focus on electrification where we're moving away from natural gas for space and water heating, electrifying those buildings. And so that, with that underlying clean electricity, we can take on these other two big sectors that are major sources of GHG in our inventory. Of course, there's also the oil and gas sector. And Colorado has been a national leader. We were the first state to adopt regulations to reduce methane from oil and gas. But if Colorado is going to achieve its goals, there's going to have to be a lot more done in that sector as well. As far as obstacles, and if you want, Margaret, we can switch back to the as far as the obstacles, or the way I guess I would put it is, the challenges that we'll need to overcome. I'd say, there's two obstacles that I would identify. One, of course, has just been the lack of federal engagement. But as far as obstacles related to, those two priorities, are the priorities that I mentioned with the transformation, for example, in the building sector and in the transportation sector. It's really the time frame that we need to act in order to achieve those reductions that climate science needs, or excuse me, that climate science tells us that we need to achieve. And so when we think about the built environment and the transportation sector, you think about how much time it takes for example, the vehicle fleet to turn over or building stock to turn over. So what we really need is in the next year or so to put laws in place to begin that transformation, and having the will, though, to do that, knowing that that's what it's going to take to get us to our 90% reduction by 2050, our 50% reduction by 2030, but also realizing that those big measures really aren't going to bear fruit, and we'll only begin to see sort of reductions by the time we get to our 2025 milestone. So again, that is, the obstacle is that hurdle of time, but it also shows then also that we'll have to make up for the near term in those other sectors, for example, from oil and gas, or looking at potentially reduced vehicle miles traveled in the transportation sector while we're waiting for that electrification in those important sectors to catch up. And then finally, as far as suggestions on how businesses can add value or be engaged in the process, of course, participating in that stakeholder process that I mentioned, in the commission's rule adoption process, and I suspect Trisha will talk a little bit about that more as well. But as I mentioned, what has really driven the transportation, or I'm trying to get all this in 5 minutes. What has really driven the change in the electric sector has really not been regulation as much as the entrepreneurial spirit, the idea that we've had this transformation driven by new technology and innovation. And so I think where business can certainly add value is when we're developing these rules. If we can develop those rules in a way that really facilitate the bringing on of these new technologies and allows us to sort of be the incubator of that innovation, that's the way we want to structure those regulations, because there's certainly no shortage of challenges that we will face in meeting these goals. But when we think there's to build a better mousetrap, you need a mouse problem in the first place, right? And there's certainly no shortage of novel problems that we will need to solve here. So I guess I will close by saying, I look forward to, working with all of you on solving those problems. And it's certainly, that's a lot to try to pack into 5 minutes, and I'm happy to really dig in on any of those in the question and answer session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Clay. Yes, we gave 5 to 7 minutes, and it's such a short time to answer all of these thoughts, but we wanted to leave time for everybody to ask questions so that we might facilitate more dialogue. Thank you so much, Clay. And Keith, thank you for joining us. Do you want to share your screen with slides, or would you like me to leave it on this or go back to the 2005 inventory?
No, I think it's fine to leave this slide up for the moment. Appreciate that. So my name's Keith Hay. I'm the Director of Policy at the State Energy Office. And just by way of background, for those that don't know, the Energy Office is an office of the governor. And one of the key things that we do related to this conversation is we represent the governor and the governor's agenda before the Air Quality Control Commission and the Public Utilities Commission. And so I think as I think about the questions of keys for what we're doing on implementation of the roadmap, it really starts with that representation before the Air Quality Control Commission and the PUC. I think, one of the things coming forward over the next year to 18 months is we'll see a number of utility electric resource plans. As Clay pointed out, in looking at the 2005 baseline, we're really looking at a transition, and those electric resource plans and clean energy plans are going to be a key to getting to that 2025 and 2030 goal. So for us, that's a priority. I think the second priority really is working towards the goal of getting 940,000 electric vehicles on the road. As Clay identified, transportation is overtaking the electric sector as the leading source of emissions. And so for us, that vehicle electrification piece is really important as well. And then, thinking not just about the work that we're currently doing, but the upcoming legislative session, I think we've identified a range of opportunities within the two sectors outside of the electric sector, transportation and the built environment, that we feel like are really going to be key to helping to get to the emissions reduction goals. And so we're looking at things like benchmarking buildings and building performance standards, potentially beneficial electrification plans, legislation around renewable natural gas, and possibly modernizing gas demand side management programs. And so some of that work goes before the Public Utilities Commission. Some of that work may occur in other places. And I'm leaving those there to tee up really a conversation around maybe some details about that, and happy to dig in later on. But I think, as I think about the obstacles question, I agree with everything that Clay has said, but I think one of the real challenges that we've identified is when you think about the electric sector, you can get big amounts of savings in big blocks. You take coal plants offline and replace them with renewables, and that's a large amount of savings. But as we start to look at the transportation sector and the built environment, it really becomes a question of how quickly we can get individuals, whether that's corporations or individual Coloradans, to make choices to reduce emissions. And that could be things like benchmarking their building and reducing energy use, replacing a gas hot water heater with an electrified hot water heater, replacing an internal combustion engine with an electric vehicle or a clean fuel engine. And I think that's really part of what's driving our push as we think about a legislative agenda, is how can we make it easier for Coloradans to make those choices. And so when we think about benchmarking, it's really making sure that building owners, especially large building or owners of large buildings, understand what their energy use is. And that's really that first step. What is the energy use? And from there, the question becomes, how can I reduce that energy use? Because that's going to lead to emissions reductions over time. And so in addition to all of the obstacles that Clay identified, I think, really making sure that we're putting in place the right mechanisms for individuals to make choices that reduce emissions is going to be a powerful tool moving forward. In terms of how the business community can engage, obviously we'll have a stakeholder process around all of our legislation, but I think Clay's right that, it also starts with voluntary action. And, a lot of the businesses on this call are dedicated environmental stewards interested and concerned about this issue. And so doing things like making sure that your employees have opportunities to reduce vehicle miles traveled so that they're not generating the emissions that they might have generated, or, making it easier for them to have electric vehicles and charge them at work if they need to be able to do that. Making all of those choices to really lead by example as businesses, I think is a powerful model. And then as you do that, really making sure that your colleagues and the business community understand that the case for that isn't just, good stewardship, that often there's a good, solid business case for making those choices, and really getting that word out that, it's good for business, it's good for your employees, and helps in that way. So happy to dig in on some of the work that we're doing on energy and transportation and buildings. But realize we've only got 5 minutes, and I want to make sure Trisha's got her time as well.
Thank you so much, Keith. And yes, it's so excellent to finish it up with the idea that it is a good business case for business, particularly if you're looking at managing your business through the triple bottom line. So you're looking at what we can oftentimes refer to as externalities with the environment. So now we'll hear from Trisha Oeth with the Air Quality Control Commission. And thank you so much for joining us, Trisha.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it. I'm the Director of Environmental Boards and Commissions at the Department of Public Health and Environment, and in that capacity, I work very closely with the Air Quality Control Commission. I just want to be clear, I don't sit on the commission, and I really can't speak totally on their behalf. Only the 9 of them can do that. But I, can represent, kind of share where they are, what I have heard from them in terms of priorities, what kinds of things they have on their schedule for the next year and a half or so. And then just some of my own thoughts really about the obstacles and suggestions of how businesses might be able to engage and assist in all of this hard work. So thanks so much for having me. In terms of priorities, I really would say that we see alignment with what Keith and Clay have shared already. The commission has undertaken 3 rulemaking hearings already to make some progress in terms of achieving GHG reductions. There was the zero emission vehicle hearing, last December's oil and gas rulemaking hearing, and then also adopting some rules to phase out HFCs this May. But based on what we're seeing from the inventory and all of the work that's happening with the roadmap and those discussions, the Commission's really honing in on the same 4 sectors that Clay and Keith have talked about, which is electricity, oil and gas, transportation, and buildings. So what the Commission has done is established a subcommittee that's really rolling up their sleeves and digging into the nitty-gritty about what strategies should they prioritize for each of these sectors in the next year or year and a half. That subcommittee has only met once last month, so I don't have a ton to report. But they're definitely recognizing that there's a lot of progress happening in the electricity sector, and there's also an understanding that there's needs to be a lot of movement in the oil and gas sector, and so reductions in the oil and gas sector are expected, and we're expecting to do annual rulemaking hearings in that arena. So the subcommittee has really kind of focused its discussions, at least so far, largely on strategies for transportation and buildings. In terms of obstacles or challenges, I would add to what Keith and Clay have identified already, just staffing resources. We have a very talented climate unit team at the division with Clay at its helm. But they're really maxed out with working on the inventory, working with the Energy Office on reductions in the electricity sector, improving our engagement with our disproportionately impacted communities, engaging on the roadmap, et cetera. And so to the extent that what we're talking about in terms of AQCC action is regulatory strategies that are enforceable, we need resources and staff that are able to do the work to develop those rules and to engage with businesses and the impacted communities and industry on the development of those rules. And that's a real challenge, which leads to a similar challenge, which is just a TABOR funding challenge. And so Anytime we talk about resources, it comes with how do we get the resources without violations, without TABOR violations. So those are real obstacles for each of the times when we are looking at various strategies in these sectors. And then the last one I was going to highlight, Keith hit on as well, which is that, if in order to meet these goals, it's going to take more than regulation of industry. It's really going to take behavior change from individuals and businesses. And in terms of my thoughts on, how business owners might be able to help, one, I guess I would just note, an understanding that we are moving as fast as we can, and we appreciate the help. And please participate in the process, participate in engagement on the roadmap, in the division stakeholder process when they're developing rules, and especially, in the AQCC rulemaking hearings, having the voices from business owners and, how business owners see the impact of proposed rules on your ability to thrive economically is a really important voice in the Commission's consideration of the proposed rules. So that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Trisha. So I'm going to turn it over to Susan Adele from E2 that is going to lead us in question and answers.
Hi, everyone. Great panel. Love hearing all these different aspects. I do urge folks to put in their questions and answers in the chat box. But and in the meantime, we can start with two. I think this might be a question for Clay or Keith. How are you going to get fines high enough to create behavior change in entities like Suncor, not just absorbed as the cost of doing business?
If I can start with that, maybe we can tag team that one, but I can start with it. Because I think that's an important question. And I think there's sort of two parts to the answer with that. As many of you probably know, CDPHE levied a fine against Suncor of $9 million, and that covered violations really stemming sort of from 2017 up to the beginning of 2019. But what's important about that settlement really is that $2.5 million of that settlement is going to go back into the community there around the Suncor facility in the way of supplemental environmental projects. But I think, the second part of that is really beginning the conversation and acknowledging that these, the communities around Suncor and some similar facilities are really, they are being directly impacted by what these facilities are doing. And so I'm really proud, within CDPHE now, we have an Office of Health Equity that's specifically tasked with looking at this sort of the interplay between these environment, social, and health issues. I'm very proud of the work that Laura McDonald and my unit with the climate unit has been doing. She's established a climate equity advisory committee. And with that committee, essentially it's bringing together academics, NGOs, but also, voices from those communities so we can put together, this expertise to really come up with ideas to figure out ways we can work work on solutions for those communities that are being disproportionately impacted by pollution and other environmental factors like noise and truck traffic, and just, really beginning to think about those questions and assuring that, that the voices from those communities are being heard.
Great, thank you for that answer. The second one is, what are you, and I don't know who you is, going to do? It's mostly the PUC to get Excel's Comanche 3 coal operation closed way before 2070 as currently scheduled. I don't know who would like to answer that question.
So I'm happy to dive in on that, but if I may finish just for a moment, following up on answering that first question as well. It's not really about fines, but I think one of the things that we as a team that is working on the roadmap have been asked to look at and to begin to understand and develop is transitioning from taxing income to taxing pollution. And as I think as we move in that direction, that too will change the conversation around large emitters. So just wanted to follow up on that piece of things. Coming then to Comanche 3, I think we've already done a significant amount of work there with legislation that came out of the 2019 session. We were able to put in place a requirement for Xcel Energy as well as other utilities that have resource plans before the PUC to use a social cost of carbon for planning purposes. And so that will start at $46 a ton and will escalate over time. That's based on the costs of carbon from a multi-agency report during the Obama administration. And so that will change the kinds of resources that appear cost effective when the commission's deciding what Xcel should do with the coal plants on its system. Two, Xcel will be required to evaluate the cost effectiveness of all of its existing coal facilities as part of its resource planning process. And so any party that's intervening before the commission will have that information and will be able to engage in a conversation with the commission around what should be done with the existing coal-fired facilities. And then the third thing is that, Xcel's committed publicly to an 80% reduction by 2030. That's codified in statute. And so as they bring forward a clean energy plan to hit that target, they're going to have to demonstrate how Comanche operates consistent with hitting those kinds of emissions reductions. And so one of the things that they've done in Minnesota is they've started to actually just use their coal plants seasonally when renewable resources were not available. And that may be a short-term pathway to reducing the emissions to Comanche as we look at a pathway to closure of the plant prior to 2070.
Thanks for that. I do have another one for you. Has the Energy Office considered how utilities are compensated to better align with industry and renewable goals?
So that's an excellent question. And again, going back to the 2019 session, the Public Utilities Commission actually was ordered to investigate what's called performance-based regulation. And that we are actively engaged in that proceeding, and we are pushing the commission, as are many other participants in that proceeding, to really look carefully at how the utility is compensated, what the incentive mechanisms that are offered to the utility are, and how those could be better aligned with state public policy goals, including emissions reductions and equity in the transition. So we are engaged in that and have filed multiple rounds of comments on that.
Great, thank you for that. And now I don't know who can best answer this, but the next question is, why are we excluding agricultural related emissions from this consideration?
Trisha, you haven't answered anything. Maybe you want to take, I can take that one though, if you want me to take a first crack at that one, and we can
Well, I can start and you can pile on, that's fine.
Sure.
I guess I would say one thing is, I wouldn't say we are excluding, I guess, with given only 5 minutes to talk about priorities, I think we all focused on the top 4 sectors, but that was not meant to say that we're not looking at and having a lot of conversations on other sectors, including agriculture.
I think that's right. When we think about our state inventory, I think there's certainly a realization that our natural and working lands are going to play a very important role, whether it be through sequestering carbon or then maybe farm practices, different ways that we could potentially see additional reductions in addition to sort of a way to sort of offset, if you will, the anthropogenic emissions that we see from some of the other sectors. One of the when we think about the challenges that we were talking about before, one of those challenges there is currently in our State Air Act, there are some limitations upon the Air Quality Control Commission's authority when it comes to regulating the ag sector. And there are some provisions that do allow for regulation, but it's certainly limited when it comes to that sector. That said, there are certainly a lot of initiatives in the ag sector through voluntary measures where in the ag sector there can be such as planting cover crops in off seasons and things that farmers can do on a voluntary basis, but there's a real economic incentive to do that. And those are the kind of things that the climate unit is certainly, began that discussion with the ag sector on, because that's something that, we've been reaching out to try to really get that in place, because that's certainly a first step while we begin to sort of better understand what
Clay?
measures we can do. Yeah.
Sorry, this is Keith. I apologize to everyone. I actually have been called to the stand in my hearing. Sorry to interrupt. The judge is waiting for me, so I'm happy to answer follow-up questions if I can, but I do have to hop off and get in the box, and appreciate the opportunity to talk with you all today. Thank you. Sorry for interrupting, Clay.
Thank you so much.
No.
We're getting to the end of our time for questions. So maybe I could move on to the next one. We just have 2 more, and we'll try to keep answers brief so we can get to our breakout. The next one is, can you comment on the relatively low efficiency of electric heat and electric hot water heaters and the electricity mix on the grid, which takes time to fully become green?
Keith probably jumped up because he saw that question coming.
There you go.
I think the next 5 questions are for Keith.
No, I think it's a good question, and efficiency is certainly a concern, but efficiency is obviously, when we think of GHGs, it's a much greater concern when we think about our GHG inventory, when these things are being driven by fossil fuel. If it's a less efficient appliance, but it's being driven, if you will, by a non-carbon electric source, such as wind and renewables or battery storage, the equation there becomes very different with what the emissions that are associated with the use of those appliances are. So, while some of these home applications or building applications may be less efficient, if they're powered by renewable resources, we're still seeing a reduction in GHGs.
Great, thank you. And I think that we'll make this the last question, but we have been collecting them, so maybe we can answer them offline later. But the last one will be, how will the social cost of carbon be included in the real cost of power, both in electricity and oil and gas?
I don't know if you're able to answer that, Clay. I cannot.
Well, I can, again, like I said, Keith jumped off it a bit, because that is something that the PUC by statute now has established, the social cost of carbon, and that's roughly $45 per ton. And so in the consideration of resources, for example, when we're talking about the cost of electric resources for our utilities that are regulated by the Public Utilities Commission, there's the emissions that are associated with that are now attributed to this social cost of carbon. So that is an expense that is considered in the cost of determining if these resources make sense under an electric resource plan before the PUC. And Keith could talk about that in much better detail than I can. But that's one way the social cost of carbon has now in Colorado been included in the law, and is considered by one of our agencies as far as planning for the future. As far as in the oil and gas sector, again, there certainly is a consideration of the sort of, the additional impacts. We, as I mentioned, are required to do an economic impact analysis when we look at regulations. We don't typically, given there's a very specific sort of criteria that we look at in an economic impact analysis for regulations. We don't typically look at a social cost of carbon, but that's certainly something that I know, Trisha the commission is certainly interested in, and there's no reason that we couldn't potentially begin to consider those in the context of oil and gas, for example, as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for these answers, and I'm going to turn it back to Karen and to kind of get to the next stage of our webinar.
Yes, thank you all. And these were great questions and a great discussion. And I hate it that we're cutting it shortly, but we are capturing these questions and are going to take you up on the offer to submit them via email, so we can help facilitate that continuing question and answer. So we do want to spend the rest of this time going into breakout rooms. And the purposes are to really dive into some of these policy recommendations that we want to see on the table with a roadmap. The breakout rooms are based on your registration. So when you registered, you selected one of three, either waste management, transportation and supply chain, or energy use in buildings. So just want to let folks know in a minute, you're going to be put into these breakout rooms. After that, after the breakout rooms, we're not reconvening as a whole. We wanted folks to have as much time as possible in these groups. You will be unmuted. Your mics will be unmuted once you go in the breakout rooms. Each breakout room is going to have a facilitator and a note taker. So I'll be compiling the notes and the recommendations from all three workout groups, and I will send them all to the participants, including the three state agencies and governmental representatives who are here with us today. So Keith, Trisha, and Clay will also get a copy of what were the outcomes and top issues that surfaced in the breakout rooms. Give us just a minute or two, just a quick second if you need to stand up and stretch to get you in your breakout room. It just takes, Jordan on our end is doing a little bit of shuffling to put everyone in the group they pre-selected at registration. If you do up in the wrong group, just put in the chat box. You can send it directly to Jordan, but he'll be keeping an eye on the chat box. Or so you can send it to everyone that says, hey, I'm in the wrong one, and we'll get you where you need to be. So that is kind of my piece. So give us just a minute and we will see you all in a breakout room for about 17 minutes to kind of talk through what are the top policy issues we really want to see reflected in these areas. Thanks again, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Part of Local First. I'm a small business owner. Have had a couple small businesses here in the area. And I'm also on the board of a rural electric cooperative, our local electric provider, La Pala Electric.